Well, hello, hello. It's my great pleasure to introduce Grammy nominated and synthesis computer expert, notorious electronic music composer, Mr. Lawrence Roger Fast. Born and raised in New York City, I guess. Welcome, Mr. Larry Fast, to this evening chat when we are just 1 hour apart between New York City and Santiago de Chile. It's really a big, big pleasure. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. One
Uh-huh.
correction, I'm from the neighboring state of New Jersey, where I was born and raised and where I still live.
Okay,
We're kind
okay.
of friendly competitors with New York, which is very close.
I see. Yeah, well, let me tell those watching this, to me, historical meeting, sorry, about a little bit about you. You've been a big fan of, I think, the Beatles, Samuel Barber, whose Adagio in The Elephant Man by David Lynch, I really appreciate a lot. Igor Stravinsky, one of my own favorite composers, Tchaikovsky. You've toured with Nektar, Peter Gabriel. You had a lot to do with some of his biggest hits like Salisbury Hill and some others. And you've also contributed to the work of several artists like Annie Haslam, singer of the Deer Band, Renaissance or Renaissance, Kate Bush, Robert Fripp, Tony Levin. You've also produced your ex-label mates, the band Shadowfax, the first album, which are quite well
Exactly.
known in Chile. Yeah, and Jim
Yep.
Steinman.
Yes, you're
Uh,
embarrassing me with this long list.
yeah, well, I have here Bonnie Tyler, Hall& Oates, Foreigner, and you've also developed some computer games, medical devices, and you even co-produced a fundamental documentary, which we are going to talk about later, I guess. Is that right?
That's fine. Yes, produced and wrote American public television broadcast uh, documentary, which was
Uh,
not anything to do with music, completely different subject.
yeah, it's about saving a place that they were going to, where they were going to build an airport, I guess, a big airport, something like it.
It was, but it was very early um, pushback in the days before the environmental movement really existed. This unfolded during the years when, after World War II, those first couple of decades, when in North America building was rampant, population was growing, airplanes were moving into the jet age, and nobody thought there was anything wrong. You just pave over, you drain swamps, you
Uh-huh.
um, pave whatever is needed in order to get the utility. And for the first time in this pushback, was there was a second thought that no, maybe this is not the right thing to do. Maybe we need nature, we need the wildlife. We don't understand the dynamics of flooding and water management. So it was a real beginning. There was a very famous book in the U.S. called Silent Spring, which is often credited with launching the environmental movement. But this was happening a few years earlier already, and it was successful. So the jetport never got built. This huge jetport, even today, would today be the second biggest airport in the world had it been
Mhm,
built,
mhm.
but it wasn't. And that area, and I live very close to it. I can look out my kitchen window and see the many. Well, I won't put it into North, United States square miles or anything, but it's thousands of hectares of preserved space with many, many miles surrounding it. That's green space and wildlife, and it's protected by the United States federal government as a wildlife preserve. So this was a
Yeah.
film about how that came to be, which meant there was politics, environmental movement, some science, a little bit of aircraft history. So there's a lot went into it. And that's my other side as a historian, aside from being a musician.
Yeah, that's great because besides being a great musician to me and admired musician, you've been part of these very, very important beneficial works and creating awareness about, you already mentioned that. So congratulations for that. Larry, I would like to go, I mean, now to the music side. You
Sure.
began, yeah, from
Um,
your, yeah, go ahead.
take it. I mean, there's so many topics, and we certainly can't cover them all in one cast
Yeah,
here. But you
yeah,
pick what areas you'd like to discuss, and I'll
yeah.
try to reach deep into my memory and see what I can remember about that.
All right. Yeah, I was going to mention that as a fan of progressive rock, I was curious to see the mention of John Anderson and Rick Wakeman, which are both mentioned on the back cover of Electronic Realizations, your first album. And then I think you were involved in Tales from Topographic Oceans, the Yes album. And I think that you did build some instrument for Wakeman at some point in time. Maybe that's the connection with Yes.
That's the connection. Yes, it's that's exactly the connection. It was I met the band very early on, and when they were right after Rick had joined the band. I was aware of the band for a few years and had their records. What I think I picked up the first one in the UK in 1969 when it came out. But when Fragile came out and they started touring a little more extensively in the United States, and I was in college with the college radio station. And this was a band that the record company, Atlantic Records here in America, was desperate to get any kind of coverage on. So it wasn't any stretch. A very close friend of mine, Frank Urbaniak, and I were still buddies, and he's still a musician. We were at college together. We were at the radio station together, and we called Atlantic Records and said, "We'd like to interview this band you have called Yes." And they really thinking, "Yeah, I guess we do have a band called Yes." So they arranged for it, and we went to a very small concert of theirs in Pennsylvania, in the state of Pennsylvania. And we were backstage in doing the interview. They couldn't have been more charming. Rick was wonderful. He and I started talking shop because I was already doing electronic music myself. And that's when I told him I'd been building some small synthesizers for myself, mostly because I was too poor to afford the Moog synthesizers that he had. But he said, "I'd like one of those too," and arranged to commission me to build him a copy. And it was done the next year. And then the year after that was when they were going into the studio to do Topographic Oceans. And I was going to be in Europe. And he said, "Well, come by the studio, and just, come, you can help me with some synth sounds maybe," or, it was very indistinct. It wasn't a real hiring for a session or anything. But I was thrilled, and I went by and had a wonderful time in the studio. Ended up staying for several weeks. I mean, it was a rather extended period. And it was very interesting for me. And I got to meet Eddie Offord, who I didn't know, and learn a lot of recording engineering and producing techniques that he was using, which impacted me greatly. It's a slightly, not more than slightly, it was a very different style of recording that was done in London than was done near my home in New York. It was a different attitude about recording. It was a different attitude about the sonics. Something closer in New York was sort of jazz and big band, and maybe other influences, but not so much what the classical influences and the approaches that were done in London. So even though I was an American, I was kind of indoctrinated into the recording world as though I was in Britain. I was in Britain. So that was really the extent of it. But while I was there, I had some demo reels of music I was producing. And both John and Rick and their manager, Brian Lane at the time, they heard them. They were very complimentary. And they set up a few meetings with different record labels. And that's what really launched my career. I was in the door thanks to them. I was setting up my own meetings, and some of the other people that I met were with the Charisma label, which was where Genesis was. And I got to meet some of that crew who I had no idea I would be working with very closely within about 2.5 years. But it was actually a direct linear connection from one of the calls that was made from John and Rick and their manager that led to a development deal at Warner Brothers, which didn't work out, but it led to ultimately to the Passport deal directly.
Yeah,
So
I was going to ask you because you had Columbia and you had Passport was stems from Arista Records. Is that the
that
connection?
was native. They were actually Passport was owned by two companies together. It was a joint venture between Sire Records, which is a very famous label, Seymour Stein and Richard Gotter's label, and a distribution company, a very big behind the scenes company called Gem Records in America. And they were the import people. They brought a lot of recordings in from particularly from Europe. But they and Sire went into a joint venture to form Passport Records. The idea was originally to acquire the rights to the records instead of physically flying LPs over to the United States across the Atlantic Ocean. They would license some of the better selling records and press them in the United States on this new label. And that worked out very nicely for them. And at some point, a corporate decision was made to let's start acquiring some American talent. And I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time. And I was the first domestic American talent to be attached to the label.
Yeah, how nice.
But Arista was a later thing. That was several years later, and that was for distribution within the Arista group.
Yeah, and they did great pressing job. I mean, your music has such wide dynamics, but the bass frequencies, I don't think it must have been easy to press all those, wide range in your record. So I think Passport were great in that sense.
Well, they were working well, but they gave me a free hand in the studio for the most part, and also were hiring the best mastering engineers. The first two albums were done by Bob Ludwig, who was absolutely legendary in the business, one of the best people. He could squeeze things into an LP group that lesser engineers couldn't do. But even some of the later engineers who had done some of the follow-on albums did a very good job in the LP era.
Yeah, and I think that there's somebody else involved in your. There was a Marty Scott, I guess. Who
Yeah,
also.
Marty was actually one of the co-founders and the president of the Gem Records group.
Oh.
And Gem Records is going to this day with Marty as president.
Wow.
They don't do they do a different kind of repertoire. It's wonderful pop music, guitar bands. It's some really good stuff. I'm a big fan of their catalog, but I'm not associated with the label.
Mm-hmm.
But we're still friends. We go out to dinner on a semi-regular basis.
Now, maybe you probably do remember about the Laserium days. What was the concept of the show, and how did you get involved? Because we saw the Laserium here in Chile, because I think there were two shows, Laserium and Laser Rock.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the original Laserium show, and thank you for bringing up Marty Scott. Marty, as the president of the label, was a wonderful person in creative marketing. And he knew that with an album like the first Synergy album, which was really a studio creation, it was closer to, people who had been doing single person multi-track recording like Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells or Wendy Carlos's albums, that I wasn't going out on the road. There wasn't going to be a Synergy rock tour. So how do you bring it to people? And he was able to make the connection with the Laserium shows, which were popping up in planetariums all over the North American continent at first and then spread worldwide. And I think the original way things happened was that the Passport Records bought advertising in the show program and promoted the album that way. And then he pushed for inclusion of some of the Synergy music in the show. And then they were going to do another production after the original Laserium before the rock show. And it was going to be more of a tale of aliens coming to Earth. It had a whole script to it. And I was tapped to start scoring for that, which I did start working on those musical themes, but then that show never got done. I don't know, something within the Laserium Corporation, they went another way. And large portions of that music that was being developed ended up as the sequencer album. Wow. So there are legacy melodies and production numbers pieces that would have ended up in Laserium 2 if it had happened.
Okay. Now, I think you had the chance to work with late, remember Robert Moog, and you also did a work with Wendy Carlos in the live Bach concert at the Beacon Theater. I think you were part of the Switch It on Bach ensemble. Do you have any memories of that? Yeah.
Oh, vivid. Yes. I mean, we rehearsed for months. It was a wonderful ensemble. Very good players. Jordan Rudess was in that as well. from Dream Theater and his own solo career. There were, I, off the top of my head, I think Gloria Chang, who was the uh, principal pianist with the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra. I believe that was her association. It was a very top drawer people, and I was flattered to be involved. I think, the only one of the 8 of us in the ensemble who was not conservatory trained. I was just a rock and roller who got lucky and practiced a lot. But it was really amazing. Wendy's been a friend for nearly 50 years at this point, and we share a lot of similar interests in electronics and science and politics and philosophy and photography, you name it. She's actually I'm kind of a little bit of an amateur astronomer. She is almost full-blown professional. She's one of those people that was chasing eclipses all over the world when she was younger. She would travel to Africa or to China or wherever an eclipse was going to pass. But I was very flattered that she included me, and I was just hoping I could live up to her expectations. But we did very well. It was a one-off show as part of a Bach weekend that was produced at the Beacon Theater in New York. And we were the closer. We were the big show closer.
I think she rarely ever does or have done live shows.
Very, very rarely. I mean, most of them she's done in her younger days. She would do appearances occasionally, young people's concerts, and talk about synthesizers and maybe show a little bit like a teacher. But in terms of straight up performance, this is one of the very few times that ever happened. It was kind of legendary. I felt it was as it was happening, even in the 3 months or so of weekly rehearsals as we were leading up to it. I knew it was going to be special.
And nobody taped it on video? There is no...
There was no formal video done, but I know they're out there.
Okay.
I've seen snippets, I've heard of them, but they're amateur from the seats kind of
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
It's sort of there. I have video that I shot during rehearsals, but they're just with my little camcorder, 8mm camcorder, from my position of us in the rehearsal rooms in New York. But it memorialized a little bit of what was going on, again, because I knew.
Well, that's good.
Being made.
That's gold. Don't ever lose it.
No, I've got. In fact, I need to retransfer it to better digital formats now. Back then, it was archived on VHS from the 8mm, but we can do better than that now.
Now, Larry, about your inspiration for making music, to me, the symphonic, sometimes obscure, and even cinematic nature of your music, especially the first 3 albums, sequencer, realizations, and chords, maybe comes from some mental pictures from science fiction reading, astronomy, now that you just mentioned it, photography, and maybe even architecture could have influenced your music. Some of your records, like the Metropolitan Street, for example. Where did the music originate in your mind?
Well, it's probably from a number of sources. I was always exposed to music growing up. My father was an early adopter of hi-fi systems and was an avid record collector of his own during the big band era. So there was always music, whether it was Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller, big band from the 1930s and 40s, or orchestral music. He started building a very good LP collection, which I now have in my house, of influential pieces, and that's where the Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky and all of that comes in. George Gershwin was in there, as kind of a bridge between the pop songwriting and the serious music of Rhapsody in Blue and American in Paris, or any of those pieces. So it was there, and I remember even as a little kid, I was hearing music in my head. I just knew I would have an imaginary score going in my head to different things. I know the first time I flew on an airplane when I was 9 years old, and in my head there was a music score as we were taking off, going down the runway. The 4 big propellers straining. It was just before jets, and we're up and getting off the ground, and it just felt like a movie to me. Life is a movie. Well, a movie needs a score. So the music was always there. The other thing was when I started building radios for myself as an electronics hobbyist, little radios, and this would have been when I was quite young, from kits. There was really only one radio station nearby that I could get with these little radios, these little diode powered radios. And they happened to play a lot of Broadway cast albums. So all the great Broadway shows were what I was listening to in my pre-rock and roll days. And I think that infused in there too. And being close to New York, we would occasionally go to see musicals in their first run when they were still on Broadway. So things like The Sound of Music or some of those. And that continued later, even when I was a recording artist, when Sweeney Todd, when Stephen Sondheim first put that out. I was out there to see that with the original cast. So that's probably another stream that fed into this, whatever's going on in my mind that spits out the music. But the electronic part of it is the medium that I wanted to work in, even if melodic structures and orchestrations were influenced by what came before.
Now that you just mentioned, and I'm a big fan of Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, I became a fanatic of that particular piece of music when I saw Fantasia by Walt Disney, at 8 years old. And I think there could be some hints of it on electronic realizations, because these tempo changes and it just came to my mind. And I believe, yeah.
Well, when I was taking a course in college with on 20th century composition, and we went to see the New York City Ballet performing some of the Stravinsky pieces, and I think it was Petrushka was what we'd gone to see. And I remember being in there and hearing there's a section of Petrushka, and I couldn't name the part, but it is remarkably similar in the pulse of the beat to the Yes song, Your Move. It's kind of got a strumming bit to it with a pulse of the beat of the drum and the dancing that's going over that. So that those kind of influences, I could see there was this linkage between where progressive rock was starting to go at that point, when it was still more melodic and less about soloing. Yeah. And where it was in my own case, it's probably the Firebird was the one that really attracted me, because I've been spending the last 55 or more years trying to figure out what his thought process was that led him to come up with those changes. But I like them very much. So.
Yeah. And Jill Anderson is Scott singing Rite of Spring, the introduction of he sings in Yes songs in the movie, in the shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they was opened with the finale to Firebird. Or I don't know if they're still doing it, but a couple of years ago when I saw the current Steve Howe version of the band.
And they still use it.
They were still using it then. I don't know if they've changed.
Yeah. Now, from that cinematic mind of yours, Larry, you haven't been so active within the movie soundtrack field. I'm thinking of the Jupiter Menace, Gremlins, and Peter Gabriel's Birdie, but you do have a relation with commercials and some documentaries. You've been working for publicity in some way?
Yeah, well, that's, I think some of that is a function of the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. I had explored this film scoring work back. Well, let me take it back. The Jupiter Menace, which is not the best movie ever made, but it fell in our laps. It was a small budget film being made in Los Angeles, and the director and the producer were fans of my music. So they came to Passport Records to license the use of some of the music. And then as they got into the production, they were realizing, geez, there's no piece of music that fits this scene or this scene. So they came back and said, well, could you write like about another 10 or 12 minutes, 15 minutes of music for us to do in the movie? And between the label and myself, we said, yeah, that'd be good. And then we'll get a soundtrack album out of this. And for me, I flew out to I worked on the music writing on the East Coast. And then I flew the 3,000 miles out to the West Coast, to Los Angeles, from the New York area. and stayed in for the final mixing and production. And it was good for me because that was a field I knew a bit about it academically, but hadn't worked in it. I was a record guy. I wasn't a film and television guy. So I learned the techniques and, how the hierarchies work and who's in charge and how film goes together. And this was at the very end of everything being very film oriented. It was the old technologies, the same technologies that had been around for the decades, since, at least since the end of World War II, and some of it earlier, pre-digital. And so it was good for me. I learned how that worked. And I thought, well, this will be fun. Let me see if I can land some other work in the scoring world. And the attorney that I worked with, the entertainment lawyer in New York, he and I flew back out to California a year later because the film The Right Stuff was in production. And I thought, I love space and NASA and moon trips, and I would like to I'd like to be involved in that movie. I thought Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, about the early days of the space program was really special. And I thought, boy, if I can score that, I'll be very happy. So we actually, through my lawyer, who was very well connected, got meetings I was on the Warner Brothers lot with the film company, the lad company that was making the film. They couldn't have been nicer. I actually wrote 2 pieces as sort of on spec and said, well, here's the kind of thing I would do for you. And they loved those. And then at the end of the discussions, they said, look, we got a problem. Our last big film was Chariots of Fire, and Vangelis scored that. And he wants to do this film. We won an Academy Award with him. We'd be nuts not to go with him. So we're going to go with him. But, we'll keep your name on file. And I met with some agents and other people. Now, the interesting thing is Vangelis dropped out. I don't know exactly. To this day, I do not know what went wrong. But they had to go back to one of the more traditional Hollywood, LA composers to fill it in. They did come back to me, but I was on tour with Peter Gabriel, and I couldn't leave the tour. I was obligated. It would have been almost immoral to do that. And, I didn't have an ironclad contract. I probably could have walked out, but I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that to Peter. I wouldn't do that to the band. And we had many months to go. So it was just impossible for me. But it was very flattering that they did come back to me about that. And I made a few other stabs at the Hollywood scoring world. And essentially, I was told there's a hierarchy. There's the agents that control it. There are different entertainment lawyers who are often the same and interact with the studio presidents. You need to be here in LA. You need to pick up and move 3,000 miles away. And I didn't want to give up the recording career and what I was doing in England with Peter Gabriel and other projects like with Jim Steinman. We had, in that same time period, we had a big hit with Bonnie Tyler with Total Eclipse of the Heart, and I was doing the follow-up album. It seemed like a long shot because even there they said, we'll start you out, maybe we'll get you a television comedy show to do some scoring on, and then we'll work you up to a drama, and then maybe you'll get second on a feature film. And it just was like too much. I've already got a career going. I like the East Coast. I don't dislike LA. I think it's a fascinating city, but I'd rather visit it than live there. And so I stayed East Coast. Having started out in radio and worked on and off in radio, then I did continue with that with some of the television commercials, radio commercials, and then later with XM satellite radio when that started up. Those were actually some old acquaintances from my radio days much earlier on. And then some television work with one of the smaller networks. So I've always kept my hand in the broadcast world.
And now your musical journey obviously has been a very long one. From we already know Nektar, Peter Gabriel, Foreigner, Hall & Oates, Jim Steinman. You were just mentioning him. Did all those collaborations in any way influence your music writing? I'm thinking of Delta One on Games, or Metropolitan Theme, or Metropolitan Suite, which are amazingly more mass friendly, so to speak, than any other tracks by Synergy, the older records. They are much like more popish in a way. I was surprised. I was surprised.
Well, I think, yeah, there was something about learning the craft when I started out, there was sort of the orchestral, no rules, prog rock, which goes on forever. And as I was working on some of these records like Foreigner or Hall and Oates or a lot of the Jim Steinman things, Air Supply, uh, the Bonnie Tyler thing, some of the film music with Steinman, and I got to see how some of these great pop records were crafted, and I tried bringing some of that back on some of the Gabriel projects as well, but never took it. You know, I wasn't producing, I wasn't writing Peter's things, but I could bring some of that production influence back to it. But it would influence mine. You're very astute at picking that up. Metropolitan Suite might be a little different because I'd taken a longer gap away from synergy writing, and at that point I was going through two big things were sort of going on. I was becoming reactivated in architectural history, and which was the history of New York in a lot of ways. And I had studied architecture for a while in college. I was not planning to be an architect, but I did have a good background in that. And then Gershwin's music I had really delved into in great detail, and his career, because I was still fascinated by how he bridged that pop music, Tin Pan Alley, song plugger, songwriter of some of the most popular music during the Depression years, as well as some of the most American of orchestral works. And I was exploring, could I do some of that? How could I bring that together? I didn't need to write pop songs, excuse me, quite as distinctly as Gershwin, but I did want to at least touch on what his thematic approach and orchestration approach was. And so that's where Metropolitan Suite came out of. The little figures that were in the Metropolitan theme started out with me noodling around with some Gershwin-esque chord structures, and everything grew out of that. And that's that came together. And then the other side of the LP, because that was really the last LP constructed in a two-sided recording that I had done. Everything else subsequent to that is the CD world, where you don't have an A side and a B side. But the other side was just a chance for me to explore other influences that were in there, you know, from different different influences. Again, bits of it coming out of the New York culture that had spawned Gershwin in the first place.
Uh-huh. Now, your third album, Chords, which is my personal favorite, before my other two favorites, Realizations and Sequencer, was way ahead of its time musically, but also as a revolutionary transparent vinyl pressing. What value do you give, Grant, to the return of vinyl records versus the digitalia that so many, especially the younger generation, has access to today? It's a completely different market.
It is.
What do you think of
Well,
vinyl?
well, I mean, vinyl, when the first Synergy album was completed and I went into the mastering studio, even with as a fabulous mastering engineer as Bob Ludwig, what was on the mixed tapes that came out of the studio was far broader in dynamic range and thunderous lows and things than could possibly go onto an LP. And I learned that the hard way. I came home with an acetate cut, which in retrospect was one of the best cut records that was, could be done on vinyl, but it bumped right up against the wall and limitations of what a mechanical audio source is going to do. And it was kind of disappointing. I was a little crestfallen for a while that nobody's ever going to get to hear the way this was intended in the studio, as long as it's going to be on vinyl. And I had already had an opportunity shortly after that to experience some of the earliest digital in laboratory, and that didn't have the limitations. So my glimpse of the future was very enlightening And in a sense, I was putting up with vinyl for the rest of its run. When CDs came out, there were a lot of problems with the way they were manufactured, and bad masters were rushed into production. But there was one, and I don't remember who it was, but I think it might have been an engineer at Sony, when people were complaining about, oh, CDs aren't any good, they don't sound as good as vinyl. It's an inherently flawed medium. And that engineer said, "Did you ever hear a CD that lived up to your expectations, that met or exceeded vinyl?" And everybody would go, "Oh yeah, this one," and they would name one CD or two CDs or half a dozen, and they would say those ones are great, but everything else is junk. And his retort, and I adopted it, was, if you heard one that worked for you, that proves the medium is not the problem. It's its implementation. And it's a new medium, and we're just learning how to do it. And if you listen to LPs that came out in the very late 1940s, there's a lot of problems with them too. They were still learning how to get it as good as it eventually got. It still hit the wall, but they got good. But I was very happy to see digital come in, and I was happy to try and exploit CDs to their fullest, even though the laboratory-based digital audio was even better. It was closer to what we now have as high definition audio, 24 bits, higher sample rates. But it all sounded good. And then vinyl started making this comeback, and I of two minds with it, because the engineering side and the kind of perfectionist about recording media says it's flawed. It was flawed when, from the first time Edison etched a groove with a needle, there were flaws because of the mechanics of how it works. And even when Bell Labs did wonderful work in improving the what we have now, these micro groove stereo recordings, they were doing those in the early 1930s with Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. There's wonderful stuff from 20 or 30 years before it became a commercial medium. And then the LPs were introduced by Columbia Records in around 1947, 1948. And it got better. Stereo finally made it into the living room. And then it went away. And now it's back. But it's not that different if you, and I've been fortunate enough to have an opportunity to hear some of these 1932, 1933 recordings on LP microgroove, experimental recordings. They sounded really good. And here we are about almost 90 years, well more, 90 years, closing in on 100 years later, and we're still using the same stuff. It's back. So I'm a little bit mixed on that. On the other hand, the LP with its 12-inch square graphics is a wonderful tactile. The
Yeah.
ritual of taking the LP out, placing it on the turntable, lifting the tone arm. It's like a Japanese tea ceremony. There's an entire ritual that goes along with it. And so surface noise, and there's distortion in the inner grooves and stuff. It's a trade-off. I've mellowed in my old age. I can accept it and even embrace it, but I'm not giving up my digital either.
Yeah, and there are so wonderful record labels like Odeon. I love the tube you chose. I don't know who chose it, but it's a beautiful label, design. Yeah, and
So
now, yeah.
no, I agree with you. There's a lot to be said for it. And I mean, actually, in some discussions about, we've done new transfers of the Synergy album catalog, both the stereos, the original stereo tapes, to maybe recut using newer technology for newer vinyl, and also immersive sound, Dolby Atmos, surround sound mixes. Everything's been archived. The one thing I was getting a bit concerned about is tapes don't last forever.
No.
And ironically, some of the oldest tapes from the 1940s, from the end of World War II up through the 1970s, they survived pretty well. But the newer ones were starting to deteriorate with age. And so I was a little concerned about what was happening to my, not only my mixes, but the multi-track, the 2-inch masters. And they've now all been transferred, captured, well, restored, captured, and put into digital. And they're in they're actually stored physically on optical discs and hard drives. And there's a secure cloud storage facility. So they won't
Yeah.
burn down as happened to some other masters.
Yeah, and now that we were talking about this, do you feel so? Do you feel today any of your albums could sound different regarding technology development? I'm thinking of the Reconstructed Artifacts album, on which you remade some tracks. Would you do that on the others, or?
I've kicked around the ideas. There's some with Reconstructed Artifacts. The challenge was to use digital instruments in all digital recording and see if it would sound the same as what was done with the analog instruments, with the patchable Moog synthesizers and everything that came after that, and recording to analog tape. And was it the composition and the arrangement that made it what it was, or was it those specific instruments and those specific recording technologies? And I think the conclusion that I came to was no, it almost doesn't matter which instruments I have as long as I can program a class of sounds. It doesn't matter if it's analog, doesn't matter if it's digital. When I put the pieces together, it ends up sounding like me. So that was really the map. But there, the ground rules were you're going to recreate the patched sounds of the analog instrument with digital instruments. If I were to explode some of those pieces and completely rewrite them or rearrange them and reimagine them, they could become quite different. And some of them, I think, probably deserve that, here and there. There's always one you listen to when the album is done and go, I should have done that differently.
Yeah, yeah.
But you just kind of bite your lip and go, well, there's too much money invested in pressing them and advertising and distribution. This is the way it's going. That's the way it is. So you learn to accept that. But yeah, it would be different. The only other counterbalance is that there's only so much time and only so many hours and years left. And I've got new ideas that got very sidetracked and never turned into synergy projects while I was doing things for broadcast and while I was commissions for Disney and things for XM radio and whatever. And I'd like in my old age to get back and do more, pick up the thread where I left it off as new synergy projects. And
there are a couple of unreleased tracks on Semiconductor that I thought might belong to one of those lost albums and never released albums, maybe.
Oh, to the Edge and Back,
yeah,
and Watch It Dawn. Those were the two that were done for the Right Stuff movie as essentially audition pieces. But they're two that they were done without the care and studio feeding that many of the other tracks got, because they were a little quicker and a bit dirtier than an album release would have been. But I still like the pieces, and the thought has occurred to me to go back, revisit those, and re-record them, really do them up digitally.
And speaking about this pressing formats and reproduction of sound, this is not useless talking about, but what about the quadraphonic format, which is for many people the granddad of today's surround audio systems? Why do you think it didn't last very long, and how much could the 4-channel format really enhance or improve the listening experience of classic albums?
Well, I came in at the tail end because Electronic Realizations is in quad. There's a 4-track version of that was out for a while on a Q8 cartridge. It was a kind of a weird looking piece.
Yeah.
And then if you had the proper decoder and a 4-channel amplifier, that album would play. But the analog version of quad encoding had a lot of forbidden zones. There were a lot of things you couldn't do with instrument placement, cancellations of certain reverbs, depending on where you put them. So it was full of rules and restrictions, which were just inherently limiting. And then it was just a real challenge to get people to put that many speakers in their living rooms back then. Um, and we worked with Passport Records in conjunction with Sansui, the Japanese company that was promoting the QS format. And they were a good partner, and they made all the equipment available, and we made the album materials available to them for trade shows and demonstration purposes. And they just weren't getting traction in the marketplace. They weren't getting it. I mean, none of the competitors were either. It was just kind of fading away. And I think that had to do with, the costs. Maybe it seemed to be on a downslope after the 1973 oil crisis and the recession that followed there. And there was a bit of austerity, and it just kind of faded out. Sequencer was slated to be done in quad, but if I remember correctly, there was some subsidies paid by the manufacturers like Sansui and some of the others that evaporated, and it was very expensive to get because there weren't too many quad mixing studios. And the studio where I worked for most of my career, House of Music, was only equipped for stereo. So Electronic Realizations was mixed at a different studio in New York, which was one of the few that had quad. And I don't think we even had it in the budget if we didn't have backing from, a manufacturer who was going to co-market. Those are the hard realities of music and art. It's a lot of it's driven by the economics.
And there were also three different systems, I guess, in the market. So I think that it didn't help much.
QS, SQ, and CD4, and SQ was repurposed into Dolby Surround for films. Mm-hmm. So that's basically the same patent, and but they just kind of used it only in the film market for the rear channels, Dolby Surround.
Yeah,
I think Star Wars was one of the early films that was using that.
Now, how have computers shaped or influenced your music writing during the creation process compared to what analog technology and acoustic instruments offer? Did you ever consider having a band, by the way, instead of going solo, or having acoustic instruments in your music?
Not so much acoustic instruments, but having an ensemble. That was one of the reasons to give the project a name that sounded like a band right from the outset, rather than just saying, oh, here's this guy, his name, solo act. Because I thought, well, it could be expanded, it could contract, however it would work out. But I'd always envisioned that synergy, much like Wendy Carlos, work in a particular medium, in electronics. Wendy's a trained composer. She's a wonderful orchestrator. She can write for orchestra, but that's not her chosen medium. And this was mine too. The one difference being that she's got her classical background, and I've got my rock and roll roots, which are a big part of my sphere of influence. But well, I mean, I guess that was. I didn't see acoustic guitars. I didn't see real drum kits. I could see doing that. I know later, like for instance, Phobos on chords became a piece that we recorded with the Tony Levin Band, with Tony doing what was synth-based parts on stick, and full drum kit from Jerry Murata. Some of the soloing that was done on a guitar synthesizer on the album was done on regular guitar. We recorded an album version of it, and then and a live version on another live recording. So Phobos got its airing in that format, and that was always fun. I mean, it was a nice little diversion, but it wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to make my mainstay.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did your music become part of the soundtrack to Carl Sagan's TV series Cosmos? How did that happen? Did you ever get to know him yet? To meet him?
Yeah, actually, I mean, ironically, I knew him before that had happened, but he didn't really know me. I'd been taking a summer course at Cornell University where he was a professor in 1968, and he did a little section on astronomy, and they had a little observatory on the campus. So that was, I think, the first time I brushed up to him. And then later, I had a girlfriend who was at Cornell University, and I would visit her. And I knew where he was. He was teaching in a building called Clark Hall, and my musician friends, we had some stupid questions about aliens and that kind of stuff. And I actually went while I was up there, I went and talked to him. But later, for the Cosmos soundtrack, which was several years after that, um, then that was done entirely through his production company. Somebody must have been their music supervisor, came up with a list of music that they wanted to use. And they reached out to Passport Records and said, we'd like to use these tracks, and we're prepared to pay X amount of dollars, whatever it was, and we'd like to include one of them on the soundtrack album. And it was done. I could have turned it down, but I had no inclination to turn it down when I found out they were interested. It was, of course, do whatever you need to do. But being signed as an artist to a record label, Passport really had the final say and control in putting the deal together. So, but I got a lovely note from Carl, and he inscribed the book of Cosmos with a really nice personalized inscription. And we bumped into each other once or twice. And, he became a really big celebrity on television and chat shows. And after Cosmos, he was, unstoppable. Real loss that he died so young because he was a brilliant mind.
So, not long ago, and to my surprise, I found here an album by the Intergalactic Touring Band Live, a project that I didn't think lasts too long. Any special memories about that?
No, it was a kind of a fun project. That was really a production. This is the nuts and bolts of the record business. It was an album worth of material written by two writers in England, and they were signed to Chappell Music Publishing. Chappell handled a lot of the publishing for the Passport Records label in international territories, and they pitched that they would like to have a label who would produce the album and get famous names on it and put it together. So that was largely Marty Scott, another guy named Stefan Galfus. It was kind of pushed along by Seymour Stein from Sire, because of course they had the interest in the Passport. And they put the production together. I was actually doing Peter Gabriel albums. I was out on tour. I put in whatever time I could on the record. So I did do a lot of synth and mellotron overdubs, but I didn't record any of the basic tracks. And then I was there for the final mixing and helping to get that together. And that was, I think, the first one that was distributed through Arista on the Passport label. And good people on it. I mean, I got to know people like Dave Cousins from the Strawbs, who I continued to work with over the years. Others who I knew a little bit already, like Annie Haslam, were there. We had people from the Bruce Springsteen E Street Band, legends like Benny King. It was really amazing, but it was a lot of deals were put together with managers and record label people, and then just have them in the studio, and okay. And the record got put together. Came out. It was probably more the marketing that fell down. It was not a bad record. Excuse me. The songwriters are actually really quite good. I still wasn't too long ago, maybe a year or two ago, I stumbled onto a cassette of the original songwriter demos for all those songs, and they were pretty interesting. They were a little proggier, a little, because they were two British guys. They were sort of falling into a little bit more of that Yes Bowie world than when it got produced in America, where it ended up a little lighter and a little more pop.
Now, sorry, I had the chance to support Kate Bush's music here on FM radio in Santiago de Chile. I'm also a big fan of hers. Could you elaborate a bit on your contributions to albums like I Think That You Were on Never Forever, and what's your concept of her work and legacy?
Oh, I think she's brilliant. She was part of the extended Peter Gabriel circle, because she and Peter had always overlapped a bit. So she was in on the recordings. Her voice is in several places, particularly on the third Gabriel solo album, and of course, Games Without Frontiers, just Infantier.
Yeah.
She's the voice there, and she was just lovely. And she was, she invited me because she liked what we were doing in keyboard synth sounds and so on, to come work with her on a little bit of Never Forever. And for me, the most exciting thing, well, there were two exciting things. One was Kate Bush, was charmed by her, and I think she was a wonderful talent. So that was wonderful. And the other was that it was recorded at Abbey Road Studio 2, which was where all my favorite, or most of my favorite Beatles records were recorded. And I got to live that Abbey Road studio life for the first time. So I was just thrilled by all those things. I'd be looking at the EMI console, and I'd be looking down that second floor window where all those, you see those famous shots of the Beatles down on the lower floor with their Vox amplifiers and acoustic guitars, and Ringo's off in the corner. And I'd look down there and go, wow, this is the place that made me get into this crazy business. Yeah. And then I'd look over and it's like, and there's Kate Bush. How about that? So
you close the circle. You close this, yeah.
It was very good. I mean, just to be in that environment. Even we went down to there's like a food canteen for people, to grab a bite to eat, take a tea break, and it was like, well, let's go down have a tea break. So we went down there, and I walked in, and I recognized it from Beatles pictures from 1963. And so it was just, I've been here before, chill. So that was really good for me. Very inspiring. But Kate was great. She's a creative talent. She would suggest things for me to do that she heard in her head, and then I could, like most good artists, you can go back and say, what if we tried doing that, but we changed it a little like this? And somebody like her would say, sure, let's try that. There are other artists who'd be very close. I want it this way. And they're usually the smaller minded ones. They're not the greats.
Yeah. Well, you never stop learning, do you?
Yeah. So she's one of the greats, one of the open minded. Peter Gabriel's a lot like that too.
Yeah. Now, could you elaborate a little bit, Larry, on the Odeon label, which released the work of very talented musicians like Neil Nave, whose Nova track, I really think it's amazing, Barry Cleveland, Gary Hughes, and Synergy. Oops. I understand you work as an A&R manager and producer back in those days. Why did the label end?
It ended when Passport Records and the whole Gem Records went out of business. Yeah, they kind of tapped me. It was when New Age was coming in, and all the labels, all the major labels, RCA and all the others, they're all starting a New Age label. And Marty Scott and I were talking about it and going, we don't want to just do another New Age label with the noodling around pianos and the same old acoustic guitars and harps. Why don't we see what's out there of the better unknown people with electronic music? And we'll edge over into some of the New Age tropes, but let's see if we can put a different kind of spin on it. And Marty was, it was really his idea to get a distinct label, because they were also starting Passport Jazz at that time too. So they could get the genres on their own sub-labels within the Passport Gem group. But, he kind of tasked me with what was happening is after the Synergy album was coming out, they would get piles of demo tapes. And he basically gave me boxes of tapes and said, you got some free time. You're off the road right now. Go listen to these and see if anything is any good. So I'd started a database on a really early Macintosh computer. And I got up to hundreds and hundreds of them. And they had, the contact points, who everybody was, a little capsule review. And we filtered things down. Some of them were easy. Neil Knapp was somebody that I actually knew from the area. He was also in New Jersey, and I knew him from some live shows he had done. And then others were just things that came in, like Gary Hughes and others that were just in the piles that had been submitted by managers and other people trying to land a label deal. Yeah. So that's how it works. But it went for a couple of years, and then there was an entirely different set of conditions that took Gem Records out of business initially, and they got taken over. It was a stock market thing. They went public, and the stock got taken over by another company, and all the founders got fired. I was asked to stay on for a while, but then there were all kinds of shenanigans going on, and the doors
Yeah.
were just locked one day. So that was that. Otherwise,
And
it would have still been going.
yeah, a couple more questions, Larry. Playing live versus your usual studio work possibly have no points of comparison. What advantages do you think studio work offers, and what does it lack from live performance? What is your comfort zone?
I like studio better because to me, it's more like being a painter or a sculptor. I can craft something, I can come back to it, I can revise it. It's maybe a little bit more like combining what a composer does when he's composing his score paper of an orchestration before it gets to an orchestra, but he can continue to work on that. Um, Live, I'm okay. It's rock and roll tour can be fun. It can also be grueling and then get really boring. But the high points are very good. And there's something in if you're playing, I mean, something like a Peter Gabriel is very popular and huge audiences, and you feel the energy coming back from the audience. There's something about that that's good, but of course, it's not quite so demanding as the creative process. Creative process is constant state of flux. Live performance is fun. There's an energy in it. It's a really good musical vibey energy that goes in there. And I enjoy that, but I don't think it's my mainstay. I haven't done that I haven't been on stage to play anything in over 10 years at this point. And I can't say, oh, I really miss it. It would be nice if it happened, if I could put something together. But the studio part, if I didn't have access to creating some new music, working on something creatively in acoustics, audio, and music, I think I would really feel a hole. If that was
Okay. Now, something non-musical. Is there any particular experience that made you feel interested in developing gadgets for the hearing disabled people, like the infrared audio transmitting system? Are you still doing that?
uh, that kind of got shut down as the technologies changed during COVID and the need for that was actually a really odd set of circumstances. My wife is also a technical person. She was doing infrared hearing system installations and repairs on Broadway in Broadway theaters. And there was a lot of need for it under American law. There's something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires accommodation for people with very problems, and hearing being one of them, sight, motion disabilities. So the under the ADA, the way it works is that if there's a violation, the violation is heard in court. My wife was smart enough to notice that very few courts had a hearing system. So how can they hear a case to adjudicate a violation of somebody's hearing rights if they didn't have anything? Where if that person was in the court, they couldn't actually hear the case that they had brought. So she tried adapting the Broadway-based systems for live performance and entertainment, and they were too cumbersome. So I sat down and had a good look at what the technology was and realized that a lot of it was similar to things that were involved both in studio design and in synthesizer design, a lot of the signal processing. And the only technology I didn't know as much about was wireless infrared audio transmission, but that it didn't take long to read up and find what had been done over with infrared LEDs and so on. So I came up with a properly priced, small, portable, easily used system that really didn't require a technician. And it was kind of a hit right away with the prospective buyers in the court systems and so on. And then I have intellectual property lawyers to handle my copyrights and the synergy as trademark. And they had a patent division, which I'd never talked to. But I asked them if they could just look over my work and make sure I wasn't infringing on anybody else, because we didn't want to get sued for stealing somebody else's patent. Well, they came back with a report and they said, not only you're not infringing on anybody else, because I'd taken a kind of novel approach, mostly to do it cheaply, but it was something that hadn't been done before. and they came up with like 62 different claims of things that could be applied to this. I ended up with 2 big patents with a whole bunch of claims. I have
Wow.
no patents for synthesizers or digital recording or anything else, but I've got a slew of things in the United States Patent Office for that. So that worked well. We did that for almost 30 years. And then the thing that changed so much was that the holy grail in that business was automatic caption, not to transmit sound. This is really a very sophisticated hearing aid, but the best thing is to be able to read the captions of what somebody is saying in real time. YouTube developed that, and more systems kind of came in an avalanche of early AI, and that's what's really taken over now, even in theater use.
Not being perfect, YouTube helps, but there are some little things here and there. The the translation is not perfect, but it does help a lot. Now, my final question, I don't want you to say you couldn't have dinner because of me. What's the near future or not so near future bringing to Larry Fast, professionally speaking?
Well, I've got some projects stacked up of which are more mixing and archival. I'm looking at a few things with Annie Haslam and Renaissance and things they have from about
Wow.
40 years ago that I've got the digital tools that we can conceivably make them releasable. So those are some things. The last live thing, I guess I was incorrect about when I was on stage last. It was about 5 years ago, and that was for the Straub's 50th anniversary
Oh,
shows. And I Dave Cousins had invited me. I said going back to Intergalactic when we met, we've never really lost touch. So he invited me to be part of the Straub's productions, and
with
their Matt.
Wakeman?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, with Wakeman
No,
back to? No.
Rick Wakeman was invited to come back for the 50th anniversary, but he was tied up with something else.
Okay.
But all the other keyboardists who had played over the years, Blue Weaver, um, just the whole bunch right up through
Yep.
Dave, who was the most recent
Mhm.
there. Anyway, it came my way with 9 hours of recordings for these shows, and I just in the last few weeks been speaking with Dave's manager and Dave, who's in England, about could I go through it. It's a little bit like the box of demo tapes, but can I go through it, straighten it out, and see if we can create mixes that will turn these into usable, fan experience of what was done for these 50th anniversary performances of the different eras of Straub's. So that's probably over the next months at least to do that. And then I've set the groundwork, as we discussed earlier, for Synergy to be the catalog to be re-explored in new high definition audio, maybe new surround mixes and possibly vinyl pressings. Nothing is set in stone yet, but there's some discussions about that, and I think that's a logical way to go with it.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Good
Yeah.
luck. Yeah, thanks for all I have at the back, which is an amazing set of, sounds. Really.
Wonderful play you have there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor and congratulations. I have not enough words to say, but thanks for the time, the interest, and you know, 5 thumbs up. I hope the future is brilliant for you because you deserve it. Thanks you so much.
It was wonderful talking with you, and I'm sorry it took us so long to get
Never
Zoom
mind.
video.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.